Hi, I'm Fed and I'm learning to make by watching tons and tons of YouTube videos on all kinds of maker topics and cramming all that information through my eye holes and into my brain bucket. Today I'm doing a learning project where I endeavor to put into practice some of the knowledge I've acquired. So get ready to watch in amazement as I flawlessly and expertly build a teleprompter.
Hi, I'm Fed. Ouch.
Okay, but for reals, in case you don't know what a teleprompter is, it's a device that lets you look directly into a camera while reading text instead of having to look to one side or another or memorize long passages. But without a teleprompter, this very real scene of horror, as depicted on the documentary series Saturday Night Live, could happen to you.
And now back to Wake Up and Smile.
I understand you've got some cooking tip.
It looks like we're having some problems with the prompter here.
Please, someone tell me what to say.
The order of the hand will rule! The weatherman is dead!
We've established that we need teleprompters. Without them, society would devolve into chaos. That's just science. So, should you buy one or build one? You can buy a decent teleprompter that works with a smartphone for around $150 to $200. But if you're watching this video, and I think you are, then you want to build one. Before I get into the build, I'm going to talk to you about how I came up with my design. So if you're impatient and just want to get to the voot 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 and the pa-chunk, you can just skip ahead to the time on the screen. Now, there are lots of good teleprompter videos on YouTube with lots of different designs and costs, but none had everything that I wanted in a DIY teleprompter. How do I know that? Because I've happened to have built a couple of them. Yeah, this one's the first teleprompter I built using 2 picture frames, some cardboard, and some wood. It's big enough to hold an iPad to project the text, and it's fine. It's fine. Here's the second one I built, also using picture frames, just larger ones. Why don't I keep using one of these works of art if I already built 2 of them? Well, in a word, bulky. A lot of the teleprompter designs you find on YouTube require that you prop them up on a stand, and it's hard enough for me to find room for my camera's tripod in my tiny workshop, let alone the big box that has to be lined up just right in front of my camera for it to work. So I wanted a teleprompter that also doubled as a camera stand so that I only needed 1 tripod. There were a couple more things I wanted in my DIY teleprompter. First, I wanted it to be compact enough to fit inside of a ring light that I have. I also wanted to be able to remove the glass easily for cleaning. Most of the designs that I've seen on YouTube use picture frames or something similar, and removing the glass is either difficult or just not possible. And finally, I wanted to eliminate the double reflection problem that occurs if you use plain glass. Some DIY designs use special half-reflective glass or acrylic, but I found another solution which I think works better and is less expensive.
I started off the project as usual by DaVinciing up some drawings. They're not great, but they're functional. Then, inspired by an Adam Savage video where he created a model of his house out of foam core, I built a foam core version of my design. And because I'm a super nerd and I wanted to learn more about Fusion 360, I also made my model in Fusion 360. Why 2 kinds of models? Well, each type of modeling that I did helped me discover some potential pitfalls that I would have in the actual construction of the teleprompter, so it was really useful.
1, 2, 1, 2, okay. So I'm going to start cutting out the pieces that I have for... I'm going to start cutting out the pieces that I designed for the teleprompter, and I created a cut list of sorts. It's sort of like I need to cut these things in this order. So for example, I have a bunch of pieces which are set to 6 inches in width. So I'm going to set the table saw to 6 inches and then cut all those pieces at the same time. Oh, and what's this, you might ask? This is called an iPad. Yeah, I'm pretty high tech. I have all my plans on it.
Smart.
Yep.
Remote control shop vac, baby. I set my table saw to 6 inches and I cut all the pieces that were supposed to be the same width of 6 inches. That way you only change the width of your cut once per series of cuts. Then I made one 5.5 inch cut, and so on down the line of cuts. If you refer to the PDF that I've attached to the description of the video, you'll see all the cuts I've done. I'm measuring out the base support, which has to be 10 inches long. It's 3 inches wide, and I'm just making sure that I have a nice straight cut on it. I'm trying to learn from my previous mistakes, so I'm using the base piece that I cut before to measure out the guide rails, which are supposed to be the same exact length as that base piece. I'm using a stop block in order to make sure that the next pieces that I cut are exactly 1.5 inches wide and they're all the same. Next up, 4.5 inch pieces, which I also use the stop block technique to keep them all the same width. And then I realized that the cuts were supposed to be 4.25 inches, so I had to redo all my cuts.
Smart.
With my mistakes corrected, I go on to cut all the other pieces that I need to cut. Using the same base support piece that I used to cut the guide rails, I'm measuring and cutting the main base for the whole teleprompter. And then I can do a fit and make sure that they're all the same size.
I have all the pieces of MDF and plywood that I needed to cut out ready to go. So I'm going to start assembling, but first I need to make a few more cuts. So I have to make a circular hole for where the lens goes. I have a template for that. I need to then route some grooves in some pieces where there'll be holding screws to hold them in place. I need to cut a 45-degree angle on these two side pieces. This is the side piece that where the glass will go on this side. I don't have a jig to do that really, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this 1/2 inch piece of MDF and I'm going to cut 45-degree blocks out of it, or like little triangles that I'll use to prop this up at the right angle on my table saw sled and make the cuts. I think that'll work. Will it work? I think it'll work. Will it work? I think it'll work. I think so.
I was really proud of this, and it did work. It just didn't work the way that I had originally envisioned. The little square triangle that I cut was too small to properly support the piece. But here you can see that the offcut piece would work perfectly. Using my Fusion 360 design printouts, I was able to transfer markings from the design to the side panels where the glass was going to go. To avoid alignment problems that I've had in the past, I wanted to make better use of double-sided tape. So I watched Jody from Inspire Woodcraft and Tamar from 3x3 Custom to up my double-sided tape game, but it took me a few tries, as you'll soon see. My first time out, I didn't align the pieces properly, so I had to totally do everything all over again. Yay!
Smart.
Come on, Rachel, I thought you were on my side. With the alignment correct on my second attempt, I went to cut the piece, and I actually used another piece of double-sided tape to hold everything down on the table saw sled. And I ended up using the little tiny triangle that I cut as an extra support, and that worked really well.
Smart.
That double-sided tape is really good. So good that I had a hard time separating the two glass panel sides from each other. I had to use a chisel to do it. I cut out the template for what I'm calling the lens panel, where the lens goes through. I punched a center hole for alignment, and then I used spray glue to attach the template to the piece of MDF that I was going to cut out. Since I didn't have a large enough hole saw, I decided to use my largest Forstner bit to make successive cuts to the edge of the template that I had glued to the piece of MDF I was making a hole in. I made a bunch of these cuts and I got pretty close to the edge on all the cuts, so I ended up with a pretty good facsimile of a circle. To sand the inside of the disc, I used these newly purchased sanding drums that attach to my drill press, and it seemed like the perfect tool for the job. And they worked really well, but it took me a long time because I was being super cautious. So next, all I had to do was remove the template that I had glued to the MDF, but that turned out to be a lot harder than I thought. It turns out you need to use a heat gun to soften the glue, otherwise it's really hard to get that template off. Next up, I cut out the templates for the housing guide rails that go on each side of the glass housing and the phone tray. Last time I used a router, I made a big mess, so I used double-sided tape to attach the two housing guide rails together, and then more tape to attach it to the surface where I was going to use the router, which will keep it from slipping. What do you think of that, Rachel McAdams?
Smart.
Thank you. Here's my routing rig, and I wanted to show you that I'm using my shop vac boom arm that I did in my first project. I then routed the groove inside of the guide rails. However, because I'm not the sharpest bulb in the shed, I did not get good camera angles on this, so I'll just have to show you what it looks like after I was done. The answer to the question of how well I routed that slot in the two guide rails is not great. I freehanded it and did a pretty sloppy job, so I used a file to attempt to clean it up a little bit. And I sanded the sides down to match the template using my disc sander. I'm going to talk a little bit about how I'm going to connect everything. So let me just start with how the glass is going to go. This is the side of the teleprompter case. And there's going to be a piece of glass. I have to cut this down, obviously, but this piece of glass will be in here, and it'll go across to the other side like that. It'll be inset a little bit. And my original thought was to hold it in place with some magnets. I want to be able to pull the glass out if I want to. Originally, I thought, oh, I'll use these metal things for shelves. I was going to use it inset like that, and then I would have one of these magnets glued to the glass, and then I can just pull it off. But I thought, oh, this is too wide, so I decided I would design something in Fusion 360. This is what goes in the side like that. And one of these will be glued to the glass. There'll be one of these magnets in here, and then one in here. This will be on the glass, and then the two magnets will touch, and they will hold the glass in place. All right, so that's how I'm going to hold the glass in place. You saw when I was working on these guide rails, these go on the side, and I'll be able to move the box of the teleprompter, the glass case, up and down. And the way I was going to attach those is I have these M4 screws with some 3D printed knobs, and I have these little mounting inserts. So the idea is I'll make a hole just big enough for this insert, and I'll have two of them. I'm gonna have to spread them out about that far apart, I think, and I'll be able to move this up and down like this. But because I haven't done this before, I'm going to make some test holes on some other pieces of 1/4-inch MDF so I don't make a big mistake and ruin the pieces I've already cut. I thought I'd learned my lesson from previous mistakes, but when I drilled my first test hole, I did not use a backer board, and it showed. It was very sloppy. So moving forward, I used a backer board for all my other test holes and then for the holes that I made into the work pieces. Double-sided tape, it's the tape you really love. A double-sided tape, it's the best kind of tape around. I want to make sure that all the edges are exactly in the same spot. What I shouldn't have done was take it apart when I did, but I wasn't thinking ahead.
Smart.
I get it, Rachel. Feels like it's flush on all the corners. It is. Okay, good. Yeah, that looks really good. With the two housing sides taped together, I now measured out where I wanted the holes to go for the glass holders, the magnets. When I was trying to find the exact spot where the drill would go, I found it difficult to align everything properly. So on subsequent attempts, what I did was I used the drill bit itself to hold the piece down while I clamped it down. I thought that was pretty clever. Can I get a smart for that, Rachel McAdams? No? Okay. Nice clean holes. Here I'm just trying to get measurements to figure out where I can put the line for the two screws so that when the rear of the housing and the rear of the two guides are aligned, the hole for the screws goes right through the center of the guide rails. It took me a couple of tries to get it right. Next, I started dry fitting parts, and what I wanted to do was find the spot on the housing where I should put the holes for the screws to hold it in place. I wasn't sure exactly, so I was just doing some testing. And then I thought I got it. Oh shit, I did it backwards.
Smart.
Rachel McAdams is right. That was not so smart. Because in order for the housing to go up, I needed to have the screws at the bottom. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to move up. So I moved the screw holes around so that they were at the bottom of the rail so that I could move the whole housing up when I needed to. I used my super snazzy hold down the workpiece with your drill bit technique to drill the holes for the guide rail screws and the holes for the glass holder. I pried apart all the pieces that were double taped together, and then I got to the business of adding in the inserts for the holder screws and the 3D printed magnet holders that are going to hold the glass in place. And also discovering my next error, my next mistake. What's it gonna be? What do you guys think? What do you think I did wrong in the previous steps?
One of my favorite parts of working on a project, especially when you're starting out like me, is that you get to use tools that you haven't used before, or better yet, you have an opportunity to buy new tools. I like tools. I've had this air compressor for 2 years. I never took it out of the box. I bought it because I thought I need an air compressor. A day ago, I took it out of the box and I started learning about air compressors. YouTube to the rescue. Specifically, I went to the channel C. Jane Drill. Leah runs that channel. She is awesome. She has this really great, easygoing way of explaining things. I'll put the link to the air compressor video in the description below, and you should check it out. So what tool did I buy for my new but 2-year-old air compressor? This is a pin nailer, a pneumatic pin nailer. I think I'm saying that right. The first time I saw someone using a pin nailer was Adam Savage on his channel, Tested. He was building these little tiny things with really thin material, but he was using one of these and he was like putting in all these, what I thought were nails. How is he doing that without like the nails coming through the side of the wood? And I found out that there's this thing called a pin nailer, which has these little tiny nails, and they're to be used for really thin, small materials. And I'm going to use it to hold together the mirror, the glass housing of my teleprompter.
Pa-chunk, pa-chunk, pa-chunk. I did some testing before I worked on actual pieces. Since I had only friction fitted the brass inserts into the side of the housing, I've applied a little bit of CA glue just to make sure that they stayed in place. Next, I inserted the magnets into the magnet holders that I had designed and 3D printed, but I must have gotten something wrong because I had to really work at it to get those magnets in there, and it took me a long time. I fit the glass panel and lens panel pieces together, and I did some light sanding just to make sure that everything lined up properly. It's glue 'em up time, and it's also pa-chunk time. You'll notice a bit when I'm using the pin nailer that I'm doing it at an angle. That's because one of the many videos that I watched on pin nailers and nailing guns suggested that in some cases you angle the nails in so that it holds the piece in place better. And as I was fitting the magnet holders in place, I discovered that I had not left enough room for the glass. Rachel McAdams, don't say it, please.
Smart.
I can't tell if you're being supportive or sarcastic. Fortunately, the fix wasn't too bad. I just had to move the bottom hole up a little bit to make enough room for the glass to sit inside with the magnet holders glued to it. I press fitted the magnet holders in place, and I lightly sanded some of them so that they wouldn't stick out beyond the edge of the wood, or be proud of the wood, as is the technical term. Yeah, I learned stuff. Here I'm dry fitting the top of the glass housing, and I'm gluing it. Finally, I use the pin nailer to secure it in place. I love that sound. Good glue up with only a little tiny crack from the pin nailer. I glued the base and the base rails together and let it dry overnight. Next, I applied glue to the base support so I could attach it to the base itself. I did something clever here, I think. I added some center lines to both pieces so I could align them perfectly along the center axis.
Smart.
You always know just what to say, Rachel. The base needed to be very sturdy, so I drilled 4 countersunk holes and put in 4 screws to attach the base support to the base itself. I also marked a new center line, which will be used later on. I didn't like the glue residue that remained on some of the other pieces that I glued a template to, So instead I decided to transfer the markings just using a pencil to the piece of MDF, which will become the phone tray. I used the double-sided tape technique to hold everything down. That worked really well for me in the past. However, double-sided tape did nothing to improve my camera work, so I can't show you how I actually routed the slot for the phone tray. I can show you, though, that I did a pretty bad job. Fortunately, my jigsaw technique is pretty good, so all I needed to do was a little light sanding to get the piece finished. Sanding, 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 and done! My original design had the phone tray attached to the glass housing that moved up and down, but I decided that it would be sturdier if I attached the phone tray to the base itself. Attaching the guide rails for the glass housing turned out to be the most difficult part of this build because everything had to be aligned just right, and I'd made some mistakes during construction. Some I knew about and some I did not know about. For example, I knew that I had done a bad job routing out the slots where the mounting screws would go, and I took great care to make sure that the guide rails were square to the base. As I did the initial fitting of the glass housing to the guide rails, I realized something wasn't quite right, but I didn't know what it was until later. After I measured the opening for where the glass would go, I had to cut the glass. I've only done this a couple times and I'm not great at it. It can be really tricky to cut glass. One of the mistakes I made, which you saw there, was I scored the glass more than once. That's not a good technique. You should just score it once as hard as you can and then cut the glass. I did an okay job, not perfect, but good enough for my teleprompter. You won't see that little mistake in the corner. I started checking the alignment of the camera rail system. My design called for 2 1/4-inch mounting points, so I cut out the pieces of wood where I was going to place the 1/4-inch inserts, drew center lines to make sure that I had exactly the center point for each block. Then I glued them in place and got to use my big nail gun like a big boy. Drilling the holes for the 1/4-inch inserts was no problem, but screwing them in was surprisingly difficult. I ended up not being able to screw them in perfectly perpendicular. That just did not work. So before the next project that uses them, I'm going to do some research and see if I can figure out a better way to insert them so they're not all crooked. What I should have done here is done a test on a scrap piece of plywood to see if I could get the inserts in straight, but I didn't do that and they came out pretty crooked again. I wanted to talk about the hardware that I built to go onto the teleprompter to hold the camera. I built this. These are just 15mm rods that I bought. And then I 3D printed these 3 things. I adapted them from some designs I found on the web, on Thingiverse. They mount like this. This is a 1/4 20 screw. Another one on this end. Of course, to keep the bars in place so that these ends don't slide, I put in these inserts that you heat up and then they melt the plastic so that you can then tighten a screw on it. I think this is an M2 screw, and I heat inserted another 1/4 20 insert here, which I use to mount this, which is a plate that I bought off of Amazon, and it fits like that. And then the camera goes right on top here on this plate. And then when this is mounted, I can move the camera back and forth. And I found a really nice design for just a knurled screw holder. And that is how I hold the main teleprompter housing in place on both sides. And here's my secret to make the glass reflective. It's a plastic film used on houses, or I think cars even, that makes the glass like a half-silvered mirror. This film is a pain in the butt to apply, but it is cheaper than two-way mirrored acrylic, and if you already have a bunch of glass, this is a good way to make use of it. Before the reflective film, after the reflective film. At last it was time to put on some final touches. Because I changed the design of the phone tray, I needed to glue a little piece of MDF to hold the phone in place. And finally I made the little phone tray knob or block that holds the phone in place. Remember when I said that something seemed weird with the glass housing? Well, as I was doing the final assembly, I figured out what it was. The holes that I had made for the tightening screws to hold the housing in place were misaligned. I fixed that by sanding out the guide rail groove and making it thicker at the bottom. Time for the final test. Dare I say I'm proud with how it came out. It looks good, it works, it's functional, and it was very close to my original design. Sure, I made a few mistakes, but I corrected them and I'm really happy with it. Thank you for watching.